Species. Unite.
Zoos do this all the time, right? Zoos make these decisions all the time. It's easy to sort of think about wartime as a state of exception. This is a time in which, we're kind of getting out of our, comfort zone. We're doing something different. But what I wanted to sort of show is that, hey, if you're disturbed by anything that happens at the zoo during wartime, that the word wasn't different. It just dragged all of these things up to the surface. Zoos kill animals all the time.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Novogratz. This is Species Unite. This conversation is with John Kinder. John is the director of American Studies and a professor of history at Oklahoma State University. And John is an author. His most recent book is called World War Zoos: Humans and Other Animals in the Deadliest Conflict of the Modern Age. World War Zoos is the story of how the world's zoos survived the deadliest conflict of the 20th century and how little has changed in zoos since then. John's fantastic research tells the story of how zoos became important cultural symbols and how the welfare of the animals who live there can often be an afterthought. Hi, John. It's really good to see you and have you on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
We're here to talk about your book called World War Zoos. And as I was just saying to you a second ago, it's one of those topics that I didn't really ever think about is what it is. Mm-hmm. And even though I've heard, especially in recent times, animals in zoos in Ukraine and things happening right now, so it's not like I never thought about animals in zoos during war. I guess because there's so much else in World War II that takes up so much space. And I learned so much. So before we start, why don't you give a background? I mean, we know it's about World War II and zoos, but tell us a little bit more about what it's about for people.
I wrote this book in part because I was a bit angry and a bit frustrated when I encountered this exhibit at the Berlin Zoo in the late 1990s. And it was an exhibit showing a photograph of a destroyed elephant house. And in the photograph, it was fairly graphic. You could see the foot of the elephant sort of sticking out of the rubble. And it was just there, right? There was no commentary on it. There was no sense of what we were meant to think about. And part of my frustration with it was I kind of felt like this elephant that had died was being exploited. And what I mean by that is in Germany, of course, you can't really make a war memorial, right? You can't really do sort of mourn the dead by using this elephant to kind of stand in for the rest of the German people. I couldn't help but think that there was so much more to this story. And I couldn't help but wonder what role the zoo might have played in all of this. My book is really an attempt to grapple with that and really to tell the story in one complete volume, just to give an overview of what happened to zoos in World War II. My technique from the very beginning was I kind of wanted to use what I typically think of as a dad World War II book. There's the kind of World War II book you go to Barnes and Noble and you get, and it has all of the familiar stuff. The rise of the Nazis and the Blitzkrieg and invasion of France and all of these kinds of key moments. And I thought about, what if I try to tell the story of zoos during World War II, but sort of follow that same pattern? And so that's what I tried to do. We open before the war, we travel through the 1930s leading up to the start of World War II, and then we hit all of these kinds of major points along the way. And what I wanted to show you is just what it would have looked like from the perspective of the zoo. And in many ways, that story is so well told that I kind of thought that if by looking at zoos, like, I think we're going to get a really better sense of just how traumatic and violent and disturbing this history really is.
It is really disturbing, but I learned so much, including when you were in Berlin in the 90s and you saw the elephant memorial. Did you have any idea what really happened at the Berlin Zoo during the war?
No, I really didn't. There was one thing I was sure of, and this is what I think we always have to take into consideration when we think about zoos. And this is why I get a little angry about some of the optimistic, we're saving, animals in wartime stories, which is that elephant death. I did not know at the time whether it was an intentional, whether it was the British or the Americans, whether I learned that the zoo was very much bound up in Nazism. I didn't know that at the time. The one thing I did know was that the only reason that elephant died was because it was there in the first place. And I know that seems so simple. I think that's the most important question, that I try to grapple with, and that actually so many of the people in the book grapple with, which is, if we are going to take animals, particularly these large animals that require so much care and require so much enrichment, and move them halfway around the world, for our own entertainment and, in theory, education, I think we have to have a certain kind of responsibility for them.
Right. You start before the war. And I had no idea that Germany was like the zoo capital of the world. Will you talk a little bit about that? Because the German zoo situation kind of blew me away.
When you write about zoos, there's often an assumption that you're writing a kid's book, because in the 21st century, so many of us associate zoos with kids, right? We think, no, that's kind of children's entertainment. But, this book in many ways only works if you recognize the fact that zoos had such incredible cultural weight prior to World War II. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. There wasn't television, and so there was, but zoos were considered, on the one hand, they were sort of viewed as circuses, but especially in Europe, they were viewed as important cultural institutions. They were viewed as sort of these, the jewels of the city, and real urban institutions, which is why so many of these big European zoos are located right in the middle of cities. In the United States, we like to kind of put them out, out in the suburbs almost, but they were in the middle of a city. And in Germany in particular, this really was considered the center of the zoo world. It had the largest zoo in the world, the Berlin Zoo. It had the highest number of zoos per population. It was the center of the Union of International Zookeepers, which was the top organization of zoo leaders in the world. And in German culture at that time, there was a real sort of emphasis on ideas about nature, ideas about appreciation of animal life. And this goes back to the 19th century, and a real emphasis on being in the outdoors. And so for all of these reasons, Germany was really the center of the zoo world. And this would sort of go over into Western Europe as well. It was really an important place in terms of the development of the modern zoo. And the fact that so much of it would be destroyed would be part of the story that I try to tell over the course of the book.
Just to stay on Germany a little bit, I didn't really know this either. The whole animal thing with the Nazis, this kind of almost fake, we're really concerned about animal welfare. In a sense, there was a concern for some animals, not others. Hitler may or may not have been vegetarian, but that played into this too as we went into the war. Mm-hmm. Will you talk about that a little bit?
This is one of those things that frustrates me, and I will admit I'm a vegan. I've been a vegetarian for basically a quarter century.
You know what? I'm going to interrupt you for a sec, because there's a lot of little funny things in there. And I'm like, oh, he's really funny. But now it even makes more sense that you're vegan. Yeah.
One of the things you often hear is that, well, like Hitler was a vegetarian too. Hitler certainly wasn't eating as much red meat as most people at the time. But so much of the discussion about Hitler's vegetarianism and the protection of animal rights in Germany was really tied to these kind of anti-Semitic laws around kosher diet. You know, they were meant to make it nearly impossible for many German Jews to. They were meant specifically to hurt their cultural practices. And of course, they were incredibly hypocritical, right? You have Hermann Goering, this great animal lover. He loved to, he'd always be photographed with his little lion cubs and so forth. But of course, he had a hunting lodge, and he would have animals brought in specifically to hunt them. So much of this is hypocritical. Now, this in German culture, and particularly in Nazism, there is this connection to what I talked about, this older valorization of nature and biology and a kind of history by tooth and claw, like this sort of, valorization of a viciousness that they associated with certain animals and that they want to associate with the power and the strength and vitality of the Nazi party. All of that was real, but what we see is this kind of exploitation of these ideas about animal conservation in this period. If you pull back even further, so much of the animal conservation taking place in the early 20th century was incredibly problematic, linked to colonialism, linked to eugenics. In that sense, Germany is not unique, but certainly in the early 20th century, Germany was the most high-profile nation of zoo lovers. And kind of zoo loving and zoo going would be built into the sort of official culture, right? There were, taking children to the zoo, adults going to the zoo, political leaders going to the zoo, celebration of the zoo, using zoos for political propaganda and rallies. And all of this was kind of built into this idea of Germany as a place that was more connected to and more appreciative of nature than some of the decadent countries that surrounded them. So that would be part of it, certainly.
Another thing that I learned, even though I've been to some concentration camps, was that there were zoos within concentration camps during the war.
Yes. And it is shocking. The concentration camp I mainly talk about is the Buchenwald concentration camp. The leader of the concentration camp built the zoo. He didn't build the zoo. The enslaved people there built the zoo. They had to use their own labor. They had to pay for it with their own money. They had to give up their own food to do it. And what's really shocking is if you go to Buchenwald, what you can sort of see is there's the main staging area where the prisoners would have to come out every day, to sort of stand and wait. And there would be an electrified fence. And then about 10 feet away from that, there would be another fence. And that would be the fence for the artificial bear mountain, that they had built. And so there were all kinds of animals there. Now, this was partly due to the fact that, again, the head of the camp was a zoo lover. There are lots of photographs of him and his young child kind of walking through and petting the animals and feeding the animals. Concentration camps were also places where guards lived. There was a real concern about ensuring a certain kind of decorum among concentration camp guards, as absurd as this seems. So, no swearing, no drinking, and they needed to have access to proper, civilized, kind of family-friendly entertainments. And so the best example of that was the zoo. So the zoo was viewed as, entertainment for the head of the camp. It was viewed as a way to sort of teach these young guards an appreciation of nature, but it was also meant to teach a lesson to the prisoners. And that lesson was, in essence, you are no better than an animal, just as they are behind walls and they are behind barbed wire. So too are you. And so it worked on all of these levels, this level of entertainment for the people who, oversaw the concentration camps, but also this kind of yet another sort of way to dehumanize the people who lived there. Now, it's interesting, Buchenwald is one place. There were other places that had zoos. In fact, the killing center at Treblinka, this was, unlike one of these labor camps, this was one of the extermination camps. Here you have people, including a lot of young people, who would be, carry out the mass murder of hundreds of thousands of people in a single place. There was only so much kind of propaganda that you could use to make them feel that this is okay. There was, you had to sort of make it possible for them to carry out, if your job was to carry out genocide, you had to, there were certain things you had to do. And one thing that the Nazis recognized pretty easily is that if somehow you could kind of frame what you're doing as normal, if you could kind of give it a gloss of normality, a gloss of familiarity, a gloss of safety, that would allow you psychologically, at least for a little while, to take part in this process. And so that's part of what the zoo did. The whole extermination camp was a fraud. It was an artificial train station. You got off, there were flowers. It was meant to be nice. It was meant to tell a lie right up until the moment when the lie could no longer be told. And that would be the moment when the people would be about to be killed and so forth. But it was also trying to tell a lie to the people who were going to carry out the killings. And that lie was a lie that this is okay, that you are not a monster, that even though it feels like we are far off east of the country, separated from loved ones, we're still part of Germany. And that's part of what really interests me in this sense. So much of the book is about real zoos. It's about like everyday things, survival, food, labor, but it's also really about this idea of exploitation in the sense of animals being exploited, but just this idea of the zoo being exploited, whether it's being exploited for political propaganda or being exploited in this case as a kind of psychological comfort to those carrying out genocide.
And so zoos all over, all over Europe, all over the world during World War II kind of went through a similar thing that our animals are going to starve. Talk about a little how that was handled, because there's a few ways it was handled.
I basically have 3 buckets for how it's handled. Bucket number 1 would be grow your own food, victory gardens, right? Of course, zoos do this all the time, right? But the idea was, they would grow even more and more of their food. In plenty of places, any piece of green space would be used, to grow crops, to grow wheat, to grow, all kinds of things. Because they recognize not only would they struggle to find food, but also to find specific kinds of foods. And that would be, sometimes they called them ersatz food. Sometimes they would call it patriotic diets. And there was a version of this in the Depression called depression diets. And basically the idea was let's see if we can get animals to eat something else, something that they're not used to. Bananas were like a good example of this, right? Many zoos would experiment with things like sweet potatoes dipped in honey or cane syrup and try to feed that to a monkey and say, see, this is kind of like a banana. Most of them would throw them away. There were problems with meat, red meat. In the United States, this wasn't a really big issue because there were a lot of dead horses, and many zoos would often feed their large cats horse meat and so forth. Fish was always a problem. Fish was a really big problem in places like Japan. So they would experiment there. One kind of patriotic food that I talk about is, as a replacement for fresh fish, they would use cat meat. So the meat from a dead cat, dip that in cod's liver oil and give it to the seals to see if they would eat it. Zoos all the time would sort of say that, hey, my animals, they're willing to put up with this diet, unlike your animals over there. And of course, the third option was to destroy the animals themselves. And I don't want to suggest that zoos took this option lightly. In fact, I came across story after story of the human keepers, sneaking their animals food. They were giving up their own rations and trying to find something. But at a certain point, they were often, if not ordered, then they felt the need to kill their own animals. And sometimes they killed the animals because they knew that these animals would starve to death. There was no question. And so they felt it was far better to kill them quickly than to let them lead this slow, agonizing death. In other cases, however, the idea was to kill certain animals to feed them to other animals. And that really gets into this question of which animals matter, right? And which ones count. And the one thing that you sort of see over the course of this, and this shouldn't be surprising to anyone who looks at zoos, is that, it's very often not the most ecologically or environmentally important animal that counts, right? It's not the one that is in most danger of going extinct. It's the animal that is much more likely to bring in zoo visitors, right? It's the lions, the tigers, the bears, right? It's the elephants, these, what are sometimes called ABC animals, right? Or zoo favorites, And so what you would find is these various zoos kind of basically inventorying all of their animals and saying, okay, what can we live without? And we've got 18 bears. Let's see if we can get by with 13 of them. And of course, one of the first always to die were any kind of hoofed animals, anything that resembled a cow, an antelope, a zebra, anything like that. Most zoo visitors don't care about the difference between this antelope and that antelope. They all look the same to a lot of people. And zoos recognize this. And so they said, hey, we don't need a gray and a brown and a fawn colored gazelle. Let's just keep, we'll keep 3 and then the rest we can go. And the one thing I want to point out, and this is sort of a theme of the whole book, is that zoos do this all the time, right? Zoos make these decisions all the time. I point out early on that, it's easy to sort of think about wartime as a state of exception. This is a time in which, we're kind of getting out of our comfort zone. We're doing something different. But what I wanted to sort of show is that, hey, if you're disturbed by anything that happens at the zoo during wartime, that the word wasn't different. It just dragged all of these things up to the surface, the stuff that we don't see about. So right now, zoos are growing their own food. Right now, zoos are experimenting with artificial diets. In fact, no zoo animal has a diet that mimics their, the diet they would. It's all artificial. And at all times, zoos are making these kinds of decisions of, what do we do? How many animals? How much can we afford? Is it better? Is this animal worth more as food, right? Where should our money go? Zoos kill animals all the time, and not just really famous giraffes.
I was going to say, you mentioned that giraffe. What's his name? The Danish giraffe.
Marius. Yeah.
10 years ago when Denmark killed a 2-year-old giraffe, and the whole world, the entire internet exploded with anger and rage about it. But it was just that they went public with it, right? That's happening constantly at every zoo on the planet.
And they went through and they explained, this is why we're doing it. We do this all the time. I think that anger is really telling, right? Because what it's telling is that for most people have no idea what happens to zoos. Even if you like them, even if you hate them, most people don't have any idea of the kinds of decisions that they make.
Will you talk about what happened at the beginning of the war in London, in the London Zoo?
I should say that, there's a lot of killing of animals, and there's a lot of killing of animals for all different kinds of reasons. Already mentioned the idea of killing animals for issues of food, whether it's starvation or feeding and so forth. One of the big questions that runs throughout this book is this fear of animal escape. And I should say that this fear was absurd, but this was sort of part of the problem with zoos is so much of it is about these are wild animals, these are dangerous animals, we got to put up cages, and so as soon as there were falling bombs and even the threat of falling bombs, so many of the people in the public were outraged, like, wait, what happens if these scary dangerous animals escape? So this became the question, right? Do you destroy some of your animals in order to placate that tamp down that fear and keep the rest of the zoo alive? So the London Zoo at the very beginning of the war killed its venomous snakes and its black widow spiders. It certainly wasn't the only animal zoo to do this, but this almost gave other zoos permission, or at the very least, it gave them something to wrestle with. Are we going to follow the same path as the London Zoo? That got a lot of headlines. What got far fewer headlines were the hundreds of animals that would be killed after that moment. And these were things that weren't really talked about. And they would be killed for all kinds of reasons. One, there was a fear of the aquarium being bombed, it would explode. And they tried to take certain of the mammals, take the certain electric eels, place them in various things. But, basically all of those animals had to go. And then, of course, there was this almost preventative anticipation of problems to come. And that would lead to hundreds of animals being killed, sometimes for food reasons, but for other reasons as well. All around the world, zoos would find themselves constantly badgered by this idea of, why don't you kill your animals? Why don't you destroy your animals? What if they escape? The Seattle Zoo would cut the antlers off of its deer, right, to what they called at the time, remove them, deprive them of their fighting weapons. There would be animals that would be chained up in case of an air. And this is in the United States. So there would be killing for food, killing for as a way of kind of staying alive, killing for fear. But of course, there would be other things. So one thing that I also talk about is this really disturbing moment at the Tokyo Zoo. And this is in 1943. I should say that, and others who've looked at this have sort of noted that Japanese zoos tended to be far more willing to kill their animals than other nations. And, Japan was devastated for the war. But the idea was this, that there would carry out a series of propaganda killings, right? And so these would be killings that would have a distinct ideological message. And that message was around sacrifice and resolve. The idea would be to sort of convince the Japanese people, the Tokyoites in particular, about the need to fight, about essentially just how much struggle would be involved. And so the idea would almost be to sacrifice certain high-profile zoo animals as a way of reminding the Japanese people just what was being asked of them. So there would be a number of animals who would die in sometimes very bizarre ways. Some of them would be shot. Bullets were hard to come by, so a lot of animals would be strangled. American buffalo would be killed with a pickaxe. But most famously, there would be 3 elephants, and these would be starved to death. There is pretty good evidence that the main leader of the zoo tried to find a place for them to go, but he was essentially overruled by the governor of Tokyo. And so the idea was that these animals would be starved to death. They couldn't be poisoned, so that was the only way to have them go. And of course, this took weeks of time. So even though the zoo held this official ceremony for its animal martyrs and would talk about them as animal martyrs, just as the people of Japan were these martyrs in this greater cause. And this was a public event and children were there. And meanwhile, and you can see this in the photographs, there would be this one big cage in the background and all of this bunting covering. And behind that are these elephants, and they're slowly starving to death. Their last few weeks are agonizing. At one point, because these are animals who have lived in this zoo with these keepers for decades in some cases. And so they'll be doing all the things that they know get them food. So they'll be doing tricks, and they'll be doing like various, trying to kind of nudge up against the cage and trying to sort of get people's attention to sort of tell these people they've depended on that we are starving. But of course, they were allowed to starve. And so eventually, they would fall over and eventually expire. And then there's even a bigger question of how do you get a elephant corpse out of a cage? And usually the answer to that is not whole. Right? So they would have to be cut up and various things. And so, this is a kind of zoo killing as a form of shock therapy, as propaganda to the people. And it doesn't end there. The hippos later on would encounter a very similar treatment. And then, of course, there would be all kinds of animals that would be injured in war, right? They would be wounded, or they would be psychologically traumatized, and they would have to be put down. So there was killing for practical reasons, for out of this fear, or for propaganda reasons. So all of these things are going on at the same time.
And you also mentioned animals, I think a giraffe and antelope, who had heart attacks from fear and just died.
This was happening all the time.
Yeah.
World War II is tragic on so many levels, but one thing that especially heartbreaking is that not only did all of this happen, but it happened in this moment where for a few years in a row, you had some of the coldest winters in centuries. The 1944 and 1945, sometimes called the hunger winter, because so many people starved. There would be incredible cold fronts that would run essentially across all of Western Europe. And so you would have all of these animals that many of which are not from there dying. And they're just simply dying from cold. And what makes this worse is, of course, is that because of the war, zoos don't have access to heating oil, or if they do, they've had to really cut back. And so say, whereas maybe 15 buildings used to have heating oil, maybe now they only have one for the snakes. And the idea is that the rest of the animals, maybe they can get by. So you have a number of animals dying from cold. And then all of these things that happen to animals in terms of dealing with the psychological trauma. And this would include, there's this story about an air raid on a zoo in which, remarkably, the keepers are able to get a number of the animals out. There's no place for them to go. Some of them are placed in a toilet, and some of them are placed in a phone booth. It's just some place for them to go. And of course, these animals are so riled up that some of them kill each other, right? There were all kinds of these sort of initial traumas of the war, and then the violence that carried out by zookeepers, and then this after effect. So I think zoos in many ways after World War II would start to kind of think about themselves in new ways.
But they didn't really think about, why are we doing this in the first place?
No.
And you would think, after all the horror completely across the world, that somehow would have gotten into the zeitgeist a little bit of, hey, maybe this isn't such a good idea. But no,
at no point was that ever questioned. In fact, the only question is, how do we rebuild, and how do we rebuild in a better way, right? How do we take some of the lessons from this and use them to set up better breeding programs? Like, how do we, in case something like this happens again and we're cut off from international networks of breeding and so forth, like, how do we kind of set up, these kinds of things at home? So all of these things were, how do we make the zoo a better place? How do we rebuild the zoo in a way that does provide something more than just series of cages and so. But at no point, at least within the zoo community, was there ever at least that I found, was there ever a sense that that they should sort of rethink their entire mission. In fact, what came from it was a doubling down, which is that this has shown us why zoos are more important than ever. Because this has shown us that In other words, like the message that would come out of it, and especially in the 1960s and 1970s, as with decolonization and these, fears that with the end of colonialism in places like Africa, Europeans would not have instant access to their animals anymore. So the idea was, in essence, like we need to make zoos stronger, better, more sufficient. We need zoos to, zoos are going to be the ultimate ark, right? They're going to be the one thing that saves the world and from species eradication, right? That was the message. It was not a kind of rethinking of, hey, was this a good idea to start with?
Which is a bummer. All that pain. One thing I thought you said at the end of the book that really stuck out to me when you were talking about kind of where we are now in the world with climate and how really bad it is and how much worse it's going to get. And thinking about putting these animals in zoos instead of focusing on where we should be. Will you talk about that a little bit? Because I thought it was so important.
Well, I mean, this is one thing I try to deal with throughout the book, and which is this metaphor of the ark, this Noah's Ark. And this is the metaphor that zoos have always, clung to. That, I mean, if you go to zoos, like you'll see arks. And of course, the story of the ark is basically in a world of utter destruction, right? There is this one institution that keeps animals alive until the point after. The point I tried to make is that, well, hey, that might work in a kind of technical sense, right? If we want to sort of say that, yes, these animals have not gone extinct because, if you go to St. Louis, if you can go to London, you can see some of those animals. But what is the point of that, right? Because just having these animals there misses the larger point of thinking about the environment, thinking about ecology, thinking about the ways in which these animals are, their lives, their natural histories are always bound up with, intertwined with so many other things, whether we're talking about plant life, whether we're talking about like all these kinds of things. Look, zoos want us to talk about the ark. I want to talk about the flood, right? Because by privileging this story of the ark, what we miss is the destruction of the entire earth. We lose this capacity to think about what it would mean to not just lose individual species, but the possibility of a kind of life itself other than in this artificial structure. And of course, I've talked to so many zoo people who've pointed out this animal and that animal that has been saved and have been kind of put back into nature. And I take all of that seriously, right? And I think many of those people are working, are doing some really interesting things. My point is that that can't be the only thing, and actually that shouldn't even be the main thing if we're going to take this seriously.
And when you finished the book, like after you'd gone through so much research and so many records, I can imagine it was a lot. What did it leave you with in terms of feeling about zoos now and going forward?
I am so torn because, as I mention in the book, and I'll say to people who I meet, that I grew up loving zoos. I grew up going to zoos, and part of what I kind of think that I would not have been able to write this book if I wasn't kind of drawn to animals, that it just wouldn't, it might not have occurred to me that this was really important. That said, I find it very, very difficult to gain a whole lot of pleasure going to the zoo. When I was in grad school, going to the Como Park Zoo in St. Paul, Minnesota, and watching the polar bear, and you would go up and the polar bear was always doing these flips. People would say, wow, that's interesting. Wow, look at how cute that is. Like, look at this polar bear, like swimming along and doing flips and kind of going back. If you stayed there for 30 seconds, it would be amazing. If you stayed there for 5 minutes, it's terrifying because what you see is back and forth, back and forth. I mean, it looks like this bear has been completely traumatized. I sort of say that the more time I spent in zoos, for as many kind of amazing experiences as I think it's possible to have, and it's amazing that, and sincere, I think so many people who work in the zoo world really are, and how they actually take these questions so much more seriously than, I want to say, even their bosses who kind of own the zoos and so forth. But the more time you spend in zoos, what you recognize is not only is what was happening in that polar bear not exceptional, it's the norm.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for putting this book out there because, like I said, I learned so much and it's fascinating. It's incredible. We'll put links to it on the website. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you.
To learn more about John and to read World War Zoos, go to our website, speciesunite.com. We will have links to everything. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Species Unite. If you have a spare moment and could do us a favor, please subscribe, rate, review on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people find the show. I would like to thank everyone at Species Unite, including Gary Knutson, Caitlin Pierce, Amy Jones, Paul Healy, Santina Polky-Link, Bethany Jones, Hannah Gabrielson, and Anna Kolner, who wrote and performed today's music. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.